You are listening to Anna Letitia Cook at Women Up Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Women Up Radio. Our guest today is Deborah Gray, who's a founding director of Totem Recruitment Agency. And what we're going to be talking about is women in business and gender diversity, hybrid working, and the impact on our careers. So welcome to the programme, Debbie.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you today.
Brilliant. How are you? I hear the weather's not too good in your neck of the woods.
Not too good. It's definitely getting a bit chilly.
I know. Here it's...
But we're decorating the Christmas tree later, so that will make me feel more Christmassy, I
Definitely.
suspect.
Good idea. Good idea. So, okay, so I know you're one of the co-founders and directors of Totem Partners, which is a city-based recruitment agency, and you work nationally and internationally, focusing on senior management professionals, including CEOs, COOs, leadership positions. And I think it's mostly in the fields of law, accountancy, real estate and consultancy. Am I right?
Yes, that's right, Anna. So we recruit across the breadth of business services, which in professional services encompasses anything that is not a fee-earning role. So, For example, HR, business development, you mentioned a couple there, CEOs, COOs, sort of general management, finance, technology, pretty much anything that is not a fee-earning role.
Okay. And so have you seen any general trends in recruiting, particularly for leadership roles, over the last 5 or 10 years? And have there been many changes?
Yes, I have. I mean, I'm lucky enough or not to have been in this sector for a long time. So I used to work for a law firm 20 years ago, and then we set up this business sort of 17, 18 years ago. So in my early career in professional services, business services were seen as very back office and administrative functions. In fact, many cases they were seen as sort of second-class citizens. They had different benefit structures. And sat in the basements of buildings. I mean, it was very, very different. But in the last 5 to 10 years, and in fact, particularly over the last 2 years, there's been a real shift on the value placed on these roles. And now many of these business service leaders sit on the board. Many are called chiefs. Some are partners. That's taking a bit longer. Particularly in the city firms, but certainly in the regional firms, we're seeing a lot more partner roles and equity partner roles who are business services leaders. And I think we're also seeing a huge breadth in the types of roles that are being recruited on the business services side, which more recently include things like transformation, change, innovation, ESG, all the things which I think are set to continue and set to stay. And I think it's worth remembering that business service professionals make up half of a professional services firm. So you hear about the fee earners, if you're talking about a law firm, you talk about the lawyers, but actually half of the employees are business services. So it's a hugely important part of the firm.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously my focus is on women and how women are doing and their development, etc. So specifically, what's been happening with women in business and gender diversity? And how would you say we are with, or where would you say we are with equality now? And how has this developed over the last decade?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can only talk about this from a business services perspective, because actually I think on the fee earning side, there's still some way to go. But we, again, as I discussed earlier, we've seen a shift in the number of female leaders over the last 5 to 10 years. And in many functions, such as business development and HR, for example, there's been a really positive gender split now. But there are some functions, so notably finance, although this is improving, and technology, where there is a real lack of gender diversity still. But much of this, unfortunately, is linked to the schooling and how children are taught in their STEM subjects. So this isn't something that's going to change overnight, but it is starting to change. And we're starting to see female leaders in some of those functions, but it is going to take time, unfortunately.
Yeah. I know I worked in the city a million years ago, literally. And I worked in a merchant banking department of a big stockbroking sort of bank. And where I was, there was me, one other secretary, another girl who helped in the dealing room, but definitely an assistant. And I mean, in all the dealing room, there must have been, oh God, I don't know, 30 dealers or something like that.
Yeah.
One woman, absolutely one woman. On the analysis side, there were maybe 2 or 3 women, but that was it. And I mean, and they were quite modern, they were not your old-fashioned traditional they were modern, they were fun, they were nice to work for, but it just didn't happen. It really didn't happen. And I don't know if it was prejudice, because they didn't seem to be against it. They seemed to be very supportive. I just think women didn't think of the idea of doing it. And I think that relates to what you're saying, education and what you're educated to go into and things like that. I think that makes a big difference. Are you seeing that there's now a change in the vision towards the education we get, or is that still something that needs working on as well?
There is a change, but part of the problem is that a lot of schools don't really understand business. So I actually volunteer for a local school to really link up the sort of school curriculum with business, because I think there's a real lack of knowledge there, and I think that's what's happening. So you have teachers, a lot of teachers, they do their teaching training and then they go in and teach, and they have no idea. It's not a fault of theirs. It's just they have no ideas of what business needs from a curriculum. And I just think that's where the problem lies. And I think there are some teachers who go in as second careers who've worked in business and then they go in and teach. And I think they bring so much value with them because they're training these children in what skills they need for business, and that's what we're trying to do here. But I just think there's a lack of connection at the minute. So it's not going to happen overnight, as I say, but it's starting to. We're starting to see some leaders going into schools and explaining what they need, but it's going to take a bit more on the curriculum side to change. I think.
Yeah, you're right. My ex-husband, he was an analyst in the city, and he was very, very good. He retired, I think, when he was 46 and retrained as a teacher, and went into teaching. I think he was teaching economics or something like that to 5th form, 6th form. And because he'd done that all his life, he brought a completely different vision to the whole thing, and business and how it worked, and everything to do with it. So I think he must have been great in that job. Even if he's my ex, I think he must have been very good. But he was very inspiring, you know. And I think when you've got people like that, if they can speak from the experience of what they've done, it can really change, and it can make people understand leadership better, because he was a leadership role in his career in the city. So to then take that into education. But talking about leadership roles for women, obviously women want to be accepted the same way as men. We don't really want to be clones. We want to have our own ideas. What would you say are the main challenges for women who are being considered for leadership roles?
Yeah, sure. And Anna, you touched on some of this a little bit earlier, actually. So when I came into the sector 20 years ago, it was much more male dominated, as we talked about. And I was typically the only woman in the room, and the conversation often centered around football or sport. And it wasn't one that I was invited into. So it was a very different world. And it's not like that now. But I think women missed out because subconsciously people tend to hire like them, don't they? So men tended to hire men. And there was a real dearth of female role models, sponsors and mentors for the next generation of women to look up to. So many women didn't put themselves forward. You mentioned it earlier. They just didn't see that was part of their future. And I think, we read about this, don't we? But women have this innate issue where if there's a job spec, they need to tick off every one of those requirements, whereas men... and you need to tick off.
They do one and then go for it.
Or whatever. There's a kind of innate confidence, isn't it? But I mean, I don't know how much that affects women now, but I think it does. I think when you don't have those role models in place, I think all of that exacerbates why perhaps women found it more challenging to get into leadership roles. And also, whilst I don't want this to be the main focus of the answer, because I don't think it is, but there are issues around childcare, frankly, because women are often the main carers of the children. And whilst things have improved greatly, I'm sad to have seen over the last 2 years, I think we've taken a back step, because I think a lot of women at home were really struggling with juggling the childcare, and it fell to them. It certainly did in my household. And I think that made, life very difficult, and made women, I think women made decisions to leave the workforce because you just couldn't juggle it. It was so stressful, wasn't it, with homeschooling and everything. So that's not the main reason, I think, but it certainly contributes to why it's been challenging. But the sector that I work in has changed, and as I said before, we're seeing more women leaders now because these things are starting to shift. But there definitely have been some real challenges.
And once they're up there, once they've got their leadership position, once they're on the board or whatever, do you think they have additional challenges in that position and staying there and the way they're viewed? Or do you think once they've got there, they can sort of, I don't say relax, but they can then put more of their own character and direction into it? Or does it continue endlessly?
So I think we're at a tipping point, actually, and I think it depends where you work, or what sort of functional area you work in, because I think, there are, you walk into a board now and you're not going to be the only woman there in a board meeting. But that has changed really very recently. And I speak to a number of women leaders who were the only ones. And it's quite interesting. I was speaking to one not that long ago, and she was on the board in a strategy role, actually. And she said she'd go into board meetings and she'd always sense that there was something, there were sort of side conversations happening, and she was the only woman on the board. And she said because the men would just, they went to the loo, they'd have a bit of a chat about, we don't need to discuss that, that's fine. And they'd come back and it just wouldn't be discussed in the board meeting. And she said, because you're the only one who's not having those little conversations, you wouldn't necessarily be able to read the room as well. But I think I do think that's starting to change. But I think it's challenging when you're the only one of a particular gender on a board. I think it is challenging, but it is shifting.
Yes. Oh, that's good. So, and I know the last 2 years, obviously, we've all had to adapt our ways of working. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter what level. Things have changed. Sometimes quite considerably. And there now seems to be a really strong uptake on the idea of hybrid working. I think it depends on which country to a certain extent as well, because I work a lot with other countries, particularly France, and they're maybe not quite as open to it as the UK. But what do you think? Is there a strong uptake? Do you get that impression as well? And what are the best practices for doing it successfully?
Yeah, I actually think it's almost still too early to say, to talk about hybrid working, because a lot of the practices are still theoretical and have not yet been enforced, because there are a lot of people who haven't come back to the office yet for a variety of reasons, whether it's to do with vaccinations or illnesses or just not being comfortable, and firms not enforcing it, frankly. I mean, there are a number of banks whose, their employees actually aren't coming back until January or even March next year. So I think it's still too early to say. What most firms are saying, their sort of policy at the moment, is that you either come into the office 60-40 or it's a 2-2-1 breakdown, so 2 in the office, 2 at home and 1 whichever way. Some firms have categorized roles, so say you have a category 1 role where they don't need to be in the office at all, or you have a category 3 role where they need to be in the office all the time. So someone like a receptionist, for example, they always need, because of course they need to be meeting and greeting clients and things like that. So, and then you have category 2, for example, that would be hybrid. It could be, any one of those 60-40 or 2-2-1. So I think that's what we're seeing at the minute. But as I say, I think it's too early to tell because firms aren't in a position yet to enforce it. So we'll see what happens over the next 6 months, I think. And so what impact do you think hybrid working could have on our careers? Because I think there's going to be more of it, whether people want to or not. So what
are the negatives and what are the positives of hybrid working on our career, and how can we optimize it?
Sure. So I think there are going to be a number of challenges. I think junior employees will miss out on learning and training because so much of what you learn is about listening, isn't it? It's hearing. It's not about, and you don't get that on Zoom because they're little snippets of conversation. I think it's hard when you've got some people in the office on a Zoom meeting and some at home. I personally find it really difficult when, a few of my colleagues are in the office and I'm the only one at home. I feel like I'm missing out. I find it quite difficult because you can't hear as well. You don't have the little bits of conversation that you do when you're together. I think there's a danger that if you're present, you're with your leader, then they're more likely to give you a project or a piece of work that they wouldn't necessarily do to someone who's not there in front of them. And that's just human nature. I think there's a danger that people who work together who are in the office together may develop closer relationships than those if you're at home. And I read a statistic not that long ago, actually. Now, this isn't actually to do, it was pre-pandemic, so it may not relate, but I think it's quite interesting that employees who worked at home all the time were likely to get a 60% less bonus than those who worked in the office. Now,
really?
that is pre-pandemic. So that's a bit different because so many more people are working at home now. It's a bit different, but I thought that was really staggering. But on the positive side, there's evidence to suggest that people are much more productive at home. And if firms can get it right, the ability to work flexibly can garner a real sense of loyalty. I think that flexibility now is one of the most important things people will look at when they're moving firms. So salary is kind of halfway down the list. Flexibility is right up there. So I think you gain a kind of a loyal workforce. I think it will work. I think hybrid working will work if there's a greater sense of awareness from the leaders, and also there's just some balance instilled. I think if you encourage your employees in a certain team to all be together in the office on the same day and things like that, just to keep that relationship and to keep that sort of lines of communication going, then I think it can work. But I've got no doubts that we're going to experience a whole host of challenges with it over the next 6 to 12 months.
But I know, talking about flexibility, I know you were recognised in the TimeWise Power 50 Awards for achieving everything in a senior role while working part-time or flexibly. So how can individuals and corporations benefit from this and successfully put it into practice? And how did you do it?
So how I did it actually was because I had a really supportive colleagues, and we worked in an environment that was, where flexibility was seen as okay and it was fine, and we were all treated like adults, and it was really straightforward. I think I was very lucky because of the environment and the people that I worked with, but I know it's not like that in every organisation. I think it's much easier now than it was for individuals and firms to achieve this because of everything we've been through in the last 2 years. It used to be a lot harder because, particularly in professional services firms, there was this real, there was this sort of real present, unless you were present, you weren't working. It was that kind of, it was always this slightly underhand, they can't be working because they're not in the office. And, certainly when I was when I worked in a law firm 20 years ago, people did leave their seats on the back of their chairs to say that they were still in the office, even if they weren't sitting there. There was this real sense that you had to be there to be working hard. And I think that's changed. Fortunately, that's changed. I think there's loads of pieces of research that have been done which show that you get more out of a part-time worker than the hours or days that they're actually contracted to do. I know from personal experience that I'm so much more efficient because I have a hard stop. If I have to get my, child from school, then that's my hard stop, and I'm really efficient. And I think that's what you find, I think, with part-time and flexible, most part-time and flexible workers. I'm sure there are others that buck the trend, but I think that's certainly what I've seen. And again, I mentioned this before, but the positives of firms that you get employees who work really hard, but you also get that loyalty. And I think that's really important. That's what you want as an employer is people that are loyal to you. And I think by treating them like adults and by giving them flexibility, you gain some of that loyalty.
Yeah. I know they did a study I think it was in Sweden a few years ago. I think it's still even ongoing, where they reduced the working day to 6 hours instead of 7. And they found that they actually increased productivity, and they weren't doing it hour by hour. They actually were more productive with 6 hours a day than they'd ever been with 7 hours a day, because everyone was so delighted that they were only there for 6 hours and they could do everything they wanted afterwards, that they were less stressed, they were happier and more productive from being happier, and there was less absenteeism. So that in fact, they had the proof just from the statistics of all of that and production that it was better. And more people are trying to do that. And I think it's Spain or Portugal. There's one of the Latin countries that is now working towards the idea of having a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week, as a general normal way of working, because they've also been doing tests and studies, et cetera, and they found that also increases productivity overall, and you get the happiness, staff retention, et cetera. And I think that's great. I just wish more countries would take that on board.
Yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. It's just a skepticism, isn't there, that you're not, it's going to reduce your productivity. And like you say, when you actually do the statistics, you see that the reverse is true. It's we certainly, pretty much everyone in our business works flexibly, and it's just it's really important. It's really important because people have lives outside of work, and you can combine the two of them really easily. So.
But I've always found working flexibly, if I can choose the hours, I might suddenly get crazy busy in the morning because I have a flow of energy, and I might be really in the afternoon, or I might have something I want to do regularly. And if I'm allowed to choose what I want to do when I want to do within reason, I get so much more done because I'm focused, and I know that I can then do what I want to do afterwards, and I've got the freedom of choice of other things, and you can just really get into it. Whereas if you've got to be in an office all day from this time to this time, you're like, oh God, you just don't have that I don't know, dynamic energy. You don't have the incentive. So I think all companies should be flexible. All of them. Totally.
Yeah, I agree. It works for us.
Yeah, I'm sure half my clients wouldn't agree, but I think it's the right way to go. So, no. And how do you find your companies, your clients? Are they quite open-minded towards flexibility, or does it depend on levels and sectors, or is it too big to really judge it?
So it's different. It's difficult because it's different now than perhaps it was. But I think that conversation is going to be easier going forward. I think that it was hard. It certainly, we've battled against it over the last, 5 years. And before that, it wasn't even ever a conversation to have had. You could never say, could this be flexible? Could this person work at home 1 day a week? It was just a flat no. Now, I think that the sort of agile working is definitely an easier conversation to have because people have proved that it works. I think that, what I think about sort of flexible and agile working is once you have a leader within a business, it's then much easier for them to negotiate a change to their working pattern. I think it's quite hard to recruit on that basis sometimes. And sometimes people just say, well, you need to be here to meet people and all the rest of it initially, but then let's look to shift it in 6 months' time when that sort of initial period is done. And I think firms do quite a bit of that sometimes because once they've met someone, they know them, they trust them, they understand how they work, then it's easier to have those conversations.
No, it's nice to hear. Definitely a step in the right direction. So any final piece of wisdom or strategy that we should keep in mind that's going to help us going forward?
So whilst things in the world I operate in are so much better with respects to gender diversity, I think we've still got some way to go, haven't we? But I think people are just much more aware now, and I think with awareness comes change. So it's making sure that our recruitment practices are diverse, that the female role models are out there, that people have access to them. I think all those things we just need to be aware of.
Yeah.
With hybrid working, we're still in the early stages of it, and we've got a lot to learn. And as I've said, I predict we've got a load of challenges ahead of us. But again, it's about that awareness and about communicating with your team and communicating with your employees. I think is going to make a huge amount of difference. And there's one thing that I've heard again and again over the last 2 years is that businesses have become a lot more human.
Yes.
So leaders have become more present and approachable. You've seen, your leaders, your managing partners, whoever it is, with their children rushing in the room or their dogs or whatever it is, they've just become more human. And I really hope that this continues, because I think people join businesses where they can really understand the culture of that business, and the culture of a business is one of the most important reasons why people join a firm, and their leaders. And that's it. And I think if those leaders and the culture can come across, then it will be easier for those people to recruit. It'll be, and frankly, it'll make a nicer environment for people to work. So I hope that continues. That's a sort of real positive that's come out of the pandemic, and I really hope that continues.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, Debbie. I really appreciate you coming on to the show. It's been fascinating hearing everything, and there's definitely some things there that I didn't know and that I can see are different from my geriatric youth when I did things. But it's great to see that there's definitely, a positive vision. So thank you, Debbie Gray, for coming on to our show. I hope that we'll get to speak to you again soon with some more of your advice and expertise. And thank you to everyone who's been listening in and watching Women Up Radio.
Thanks, Anna. It's been lovely to speak to you too.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye, everybody.